MCB 32. This is a video about the cardiac cycle. We are going to start with phase 1. This is when the ventricles are in diastole. There's two diagrams here of the heart. We're going to look first at the one on the bottom down here. So at this stage, both the atria and the ventricles are relaxed. There's no contractions happening yet. And so blood is constantly coming in from the veins into the atria. And so the atria are always filling up with blood. The pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricles. Let me write that down. So the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricles, which means that the AV valves are open. Okay, so that means that as blood comes into the atria, it also will flow passively into the ventricles. So that's what's going on in the bottom picture. In the top picture, this is the start of atria contraction. So the SA node depolarizes, as we know, and that spreads through the atria, and then they contract. So this would be corresponding to the P wave in the ECG. So the atria contract, and that pushes out the last bit of blood from the atria into the ventricles. So this whole phase is all about the ventricles filling up with blood, first passively and then actively when the atria actually contract and push it into the ventricles. In phase 2, the depolarization from the atria has spread into the AV node and then down into the ventricles. That's indicated by the yellow arrows. So the ventricles are depolarizing and contracting and creating an increase in the pressure. This is known as the systole phase when the ventricles are contracting. So the pressure in the ventricles is rising, and at some point it increases above the pressure of the atria. So what does this mean? This means that the AV valves that connect the two chambers are going to close. So the valves between the atria and the ventricles close. Okay, and when they close, it creates a sound, which is called lub. This is the first heart sound. So the ventricles are contracting and pushing on the blood, but the blood can't go anywhere yet because the AV valves are closed and the semilunar valves are also still closed. They were closed as well in phase 2. Okay, so the blood isn't going anywhere, and so the volume is not changing in the ventricles. That's why we call it isovolumetric contraction. This is just a very short phase before the semilunar valves open. We can say that this also is the beginning of the QRS wave in the ECG, because remember that represents the ventricles depolarizing. In the next phase, the ventricles are contracting even more and create such a great pressure that it surpasses the pressure in the arteries. So the pressure in the ventricles is greater than the pressure in the arteries. So what does this mean? This means that the semilunar valves will open. So the semilunar valves open, and the AV valves are still closed. So when the ventricles are creating all this pressure and pushing on the blood will flow from the ventricles through the semilunar valves and then out into the arteries, as shown in this diagram here. This is known as the ventricular ejection phase because the blood is leaving the ventricles and going into the arteries, and from there it will flow into the rest of the blood vessels of the body. Throughout phase 3, the pressure in the arteries was increasing as blood was flowing into them, and the pressure in the ventricles was decreasing as blood was leaving the ventricles. In phase 4, the ventricles go into the diastole phase. This means that they're repolarizing, so this corresponds to the T wave in the ECG. It also means that there's less pressure in the ventricles, because 1, they don't have as much blood in them anymore, and 2, they're not depolarizing and contracting, right? They are relaxed. So now the pressure in the arteries is actually greater than the pressure in the ventricles. So what does this mean? This means that the semilunar valves close. So at the beginning of phase 4, the semilunar valves close. This is going to create a sound, the second heart sound, known as dub. Lub-dub. Okay, so the semilunar valves are closed. The AV valves are still closed from before. So all the valves are closed, and there's nowhere for the blood in the ventricles to go. And so the remaining blood that's in the ventricles won't go anywhere. The ventricles don't change their size. And so we say this is the isovolumetric relaxation phase. The ventricles are relaxed and there's no change in volume. And here we are back at phase 1, when the atria and the ventricles are in the relaxed diastole phase. Throughout this entire cycle, there was always still blood coming from the veins into the atria. And so as the blood returns into the atria, the pressure increases. And because the ventricles are relaxed, the pressure in the atria is now greater than the pressure in the ventricles. So as we know, this means that the AV valves open. Okay, and so now we're back to filling up the ventricles with blood. Blood returning from the veins enters the atria and passively fills the ventricles. And then we'll go to that phase where the atria contract and push the last bits of blood into the ventricles. So as you can see from this diagram here, this is a cycle. We started with the diastole phase up here at the top, where the ventricles are filling up with blood. And then the atria contracted, that's shown here, and pushed the last bits of blood into the ventricles. The AV valves close, creating the first sound, S1 here. And the ventricles contract, the AV valves close. Nothing is happening here, so it's called the isovolumetric contraction phase. The next phase, the ventricles contract even harder and they push open the semilunar valves, and blood can now leave the ventricles and go into the arteries, shown here. This is the ventricular ejection phase. And then finally, the pressure in the arteries is greater than the pressure in the ventricles as the ventricles relax. Now they're in the diastole phase. And so all the valves close, and we're in the isovolumetric relaxation phase. The atria are still filling up with blood. This happens throughout the entire cycle, and now we're back to the beginning. So you can see that in this diagram from a different textbook, they number the phases differently. Don't worry about the numbering of the phases. The important part is that you understand the different steps. Which chambers are relaxed, which chambers are contracting, which valves are opening and closing. That's the important part to remember for the cardiac cycle.